Welcome to another edition of Just One Thing. Today I'm going to talk to you about working with Windows Azure blobs, or binary large objects. My name is Adam Grocholski and I'm a technical evangelist with RBA Consulting. So before we talk about some of the basic storage concepts of blob, I just want to make sure that you and I are on the same page in terms of what a blob is. As I said in the intro, it's really a binary large object. What that means is a file. So think it could be a movie, it could be an MP3, it could be a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, family pictures, etc. Basically, just any kind of file that you want to store up in the cloud is what we're talking about here today. So when it comes to working with blobs, a few things we should be aware of, some terminology. Of course, it always starts with the storage account. When you're creating blobs, you need to work with the storage account. Here I have the Contoso storage account. And now to work with blobs, to store blobs, access blobs in Azure, you have to use containers. A container, you can think of it, the best way to really think of it in a way that's easy to understand is a high-level folder or a root folder. A container houses blobs. A blob just can't exist at a storage account level. It has to reside in a container. Now you can't nest containers in containers if you're trying to think of a file system, but you can path things out, do some interesting things. But basically, you need a container to house your blobs. From there, really anything can go into a container. Size-wise, you're looking at 100 terabytes, but that's across the entire storage account in terms of the actual size of, or the maximum size you can have for your blobs. And then, of course, you have the blobs. There's actually a couple different kind of blobs. You can work with either a block blob or a page blob. It's important to understand what those are because they each serve a very specific purpose. So you want to make sure you're using the right kind of blob for what you need to do. And at the end of the day, so once you've created the container and uploaded a blob, if you've made that container publicly accessible, which I'll talk about in a little bit, these blobs can be accessed right on the internet via a URL. So basically, the schema goes HTTP or HTTPS, depending on what you want. Your account name, blob.core.windows.net, the name of the container, and then the name of the blob. And we'll take a look at what that looks like in one of the demos. And then you can obviously just share that URL with anyone you want to give access to. Now, by default, that URL is private. You have to do a bit of work to make it public. We'll talk about that in a minute. So as I mentioned before, there are two types of blobs. You have block blobs and you have page blobs. Let's quickly talk about each one of those. So a block blob is really nice. Basically, what it allows you to do is take this 10 gigabyte movie file we had and break it up into individual blocks or kind of chunks that I can then upload individually or in parallel. So I basically just put block and I just, keep putting them. And of course, I can run this in parallel. It doesn't have to be sequential, so I could upload 10 blocks on parallel threads at a given point in time. Then once I've uploaded all these blocks, I then kind of put them back together. So once that last block is uploaded, I call put block list, and it just puts them together for me. Now the advantage here, and really the point of the block blob, is for those instances where you're kind of looking at more like streaming access. So you're looking at a video or you're looking at a picture. You don't need random read-write access on these files. It's just more of a streaming type of file. So that's where you'd want to use the block blob. So obviously efficient continuation and retry for uploading, once again, also the parallel and out of order upload of blocks. So I can do multiple uploads, upload all these different blocks, 100 different threads, uploading all different blocks. And once every block is uploaded, I finally put it back together at the end. So I'm not forced to a sequential pattern. So while that block blob does serve a very good purpose in terms of serving up media files, images, pictures, etc., a page blob serves another purpose if I need to have blobs or files where I need random read-write access, specifically if I want to use a virtual hard disk up in Azure and mount that as a virtual drive in one of my Azure roles. In that case, I actually need something that allows for read-write access, and that's what the page blob does. So I have fixed page size. It gives me those random access operations here. I can put pages, clear pages, and I get a page range. The advantage once again, The advantage once again here, it's a little more work to set up. The advantage, you get the read-write access. You also get bigger blobs. You can actually store bigger blobs bigger page blobs because they can be spread out across multiple pages, then you can block blobs. Security, as I mentioned before, by default, containers and their blobs are all private. But you can make them public and kind of public read-only, I should say, not public read-write, but just public read-only if you want to. But you do have a couple other options. If you want people to be able to access these blobs, but not everybody, you can actually do some ad hoc mechanisms, which is called a shared access signature, which is essentially gives you a temporary URL that you can say is only valid for maybe 5 minutes, that I can then give to somebody and give them 5 minutes to go through, access what they need to do, and after the 5 minutes, that URL will no longer be valid and they can't access that blob anymore. You can also take a more policy-based approach. So if you want to create an access control list, so for a container you want to set specific permissions, so maybe 3 people can only read data, 2 can write, 1 can delete. I can actually set up access control lists to go along with that container, and then the URLs to access that container will contain that metadata that's needed in order to enforce those rules. So enough of talking about blobs, let's actually start working with them. Alright, so what I have here is a Windows actually console application that we're going to use to work with blob storage. One of the benefits of Azure Storage is that I don't have to have an Azure application to actually use Azure Storage. So I thought I'd use a console application here so we can really focus on just kind of working with blobs rather than getting distracted by all the things that go along with an Azure application. So the first thing I need to do is I need to add a few assemblies. So I'm going to add the storage client. I'm going to add the data services client, although technically I guess I don't need it. I usually add it anyway anytime I'm working with storage. And then I'm going to add one more for the sake of the demo, and that's the presentation core assembly. And the reason is I want to copy a URL to the clipboard from code, and that way we can go look at it in the browser. So very simple. Okay, we've got that in place. So typically when I'm working with Azure Storage on blobs and queues, I usually add a class that kind of handles some of the initialization for me, the storage initialization. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to add a storage class. First thing I want to do is obviously make sure I've got my namespaces correct. The namespaces I just need. Get that out of there. Looks good. So in this class, there are a few things I'm going to do. First, I'm going to add some kind of private statics here. I usually make these things static to track whether or not I've initialized storage, make sure I'm thread safe by having a lock object, and then the cloud blob client. That's how I actually end up interacting with blob storage. Next thing I want to do is add an initialize method. So let's do this. We'll kind of add that there. So first I'm going to check if storage is initialized and return because I've already been down this path. Next, I need to get my storage account. So here I'm just going to use development storage. I could replace that obviously with an actual account. Next thing I need to do is get a container, right? So blobs have to be in a container. So let's take a look at this. So I get my blob client. I get a container reference to a container named pictures. And this is the important piece called create if not exist. If you try to work with that container and it's not there, bad things will happen. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to store some pictures in this container, and so I want people to access these pictures. By default, these blobs are not publicly accessible, so what I'm going to do is kind of update my permissions on the container and set it to public access, so at the container level, and then I set those permissions on the container. Once I've done that, I just make sure I say, hey, storage has been initialized, and we're good to go. So that kind of takes care of some of the initialization pieces. I then like to wrap a couple of other things. First, working with the cloud blob client, just a method there. Oh, my bad. There we go. So it just calls initializes and returns that cloud blob client that we were instantiating and dealing with up there. And next I like to have another method for working with the specific container. These are just my preferences. You certainly don't have to do it this way. I just find it makes my code a little bit cleaner. So this gives me a reference to the container housing my pictures. So that's pretty easy and done. Let's build it. Build is good. Close this out. Now let's go over to program.cs and do a little bit of work. Once again, always cleaning up the usings for just what I need. Then because I'm working with the clipboard here, I just need to make a I just need to kind of update that thread so I can do some kind of common Olay stuff here to get the clipboard. Next, I want to capture the path. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload a file from my file system to Blob storage. So I'll just want to provide some way to get that via input. Once I've done that, I want to get the container. So this is that wrapper get blob, cloud blob container. I then want to actually create a blob, and in this case I'll want to use a block blob. I don't need a page blob here, just a block blob. I set the name, I create the name, and then I create the blob itself. Or I get a reference to it. Remember, it doesn't exist yet, but now that I have the reference, I can actually upload it. And the upload is just a stream. So all I need is a stream. So in this case, I get the file stream from that file path and that I entered above, and then I upload from stream path using the stream object. So that's good. So once it uploads, though, I actually, since I have this set as public, I want to be able to view it in a browser. So I'm going to write that URI, so the absolute URI of the blob, out to the console. And I'm also going to do one other thing. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. So that way I'll pop a browser up and we can take a look at it. And then, of course, let's pause the app so we can watch everything that happened. Okay, build succeeded. Let's run. So I think it's a data, my pictures, nerd.jpg. All right, so that upload happened really quick. You see I have the URI here, but now open Internet Explorer quick, paste it in, and there's our nerd. So of course this is in local blob storage, but you'll see there by making that container publicly accessible, I can just put that URL into my browser. I could mail it to other people and they can get direct access to that blob. So working with blobs, pretty easy, pretty straightforward to really easy way to kind of upload all kinds of files up into the cloud. So as you saw from the demo, Windows Azure Blob Storage is a great way to store really large files, be they movies, working documents, videos, pictures, whatever, can really be stored in blob storage. And one of the great advantages of it is that it only costs you 15 cents per gig per month. Plus, you don't get charged for actually uploading data. So data going in, you don't get charged for that bandwidth and that consumption. You really only get charged for the data that's stored on disk, as well as if you kind of pull any data out of the data center. So another great tool to use in Azure for storing objects.